August 20th, 1947, Palace of Justice, Nuremberg. 7 doctors stand in courtroom 600 waiting for sentence. They've been convicted of war crimes and crimes against humanity. Their crimes were committed not on battlefields, but in hospitals, not with weapons, but with scalpels and syringes, not in the heat of combat, but in the cold precision of documented research. The judges could imprison them for life. They could show mercy. They could acknowledge that these men followed orders in wartime. Instead, they sentence all 7 to death by hanging. And here's what you need to understand before we go any further. These judges weren't bloodthirsty. They weren't seeking revenge. They spent 8 months listening to evidence, reviewing documents, weighing legal arguments. They considered every possible alternative to execution. And then they made a calculated decision based on one terrifying realization. If doctors who turned medicine into murder could survive with prison sentences, they would send a message to every future regime, every future doctor, every future war criminal. That message. Medical atrocities are a survivable career risk. Do the research, advance your career, and if your side loses, you'll get a comfortable cell and maybe release in a decade or 2. The judges feared that without the ultimate penalty, they would normalize the unthinkable. They would transform systematic murder into a policy dispute. They would tell the world that a man who drowns prisoners in ice water for data gets the same consequence as a man who steals military supplies. And that equivalence, that failure to draw an absolute line, would guarantee future atrocities. Today, I'm going to show you exactly why the Nuremberg judges believed execution was the only option. I'm going to walk you through the specific evidence that convinced them prison wasn't enough, the defense arguments that almost worked, and the single moment in testimony that made them realize the death penalty wasn't about punishment, but about prevention. Because this isn't just about 7 doctors who committed crimes. This is about the moment the world decided that some professions carry obligations so sacred that violating them places you beyond redemption. Stay with me, because by the end of this, you'll understand why medical degrees didn't save these men from the gallows, and why the judges who sent them there believed they were protecting every future patient from doctors who might see atrocities as acceptable career moves. Before we dive in, if you're interested in deep dive historical analysis of World War II and war crimes trials, and the moral decisions that shaped post-war justice, I'd really appreciate if you'd hit that subscribe button. And as we go through this story, drop a comment telling me this. Do you think the death penalty for medical war crimes was necessary, or would life imprisonment have sent the same message? I read every comment, and I genuinely want to know what you think. All right, let's get into it. April 1945. Allied forces are liberating concentration camps across Germany and Austria. What they find defies comprehension. Mountains of corpses, emaciated survivors, gas chambers, crematoriums. The scale of industrial murder is so vast that commanders order film crews to document everything because they know people won't believe it. But as investigators dig deeper, they find something that doesn't fit the chaos. They find order. They find medical facilities with equipment carefully labeled. They find filing cabinets full of research reports typed on official letterhead. They find laboratories with instruments calibrated for precision measurements. They find photographs documenting experiments step by step. And in those files, investigators find something that changes everything. They find evidence that licensed physicians, men with medical degrees from respected universities, men who took oaths to do no harm, systematically tortured and murdered prisoners while calling it science, not a few rogue sadists. Hundreds of doctors across dozens of camps conducting experiments that had official approval, military funding, and professional peer review. Here's what made these discoveries legally unprecedented. The doctors documented everything. They kept meticulous records. They published findings in medical journals. They presented research at conferences. They corresponded with military and academic institutions. They created a complete paper trail showing premeditation, coordination, and intent. And that documentation became the foundation for something the world had never seen before. A trial that would prosecute doctors not for battlefield decisions made under pressure, but for research conducted over months and years with full knowledge that subjects would die. December 9th, 1946, the doctors' trial begins. Officially titled United States of America versus Karl Brandt et al. 23 defendants sit in the dock. 20 are doctors. 3 are SS administrators who coordinated medical programs. The charges are specific: conducting medical experiments without consent, causing death and torture, participating in crimes against humanity. The chief prosecutor is Brigadier General Telford Taylor. He's inherited this case from the main Nuremberg tribunal, and he faces a unique challenge. How do you prosecute scientists? How do you convince judges that research can be murder? How do you prove that men in white coats committed crimes as heinous as SS guards who operated gas chambers? Taylor's strategy is precise. He's not going to present every atrocity. He's not going to overwhelm the court with a catalog of horrors. Instead, he's going to focus on specific experiments that clearly, undeniably, cross any conceivable ethical line. Experiments where the evidence is irrefutable, where the documentation is complete, where no defense argument can possibly justify what happened. At the top of that list, the freezing experiments conducted at Dachau concentration camp between 1942 and 1943. Let me explain why prosecutors chose these experiments as their centerpiece. First, the documentation was perfect. The lead researcher, Dr. Sigmund Rascher, kept meticulous records. Every experiment was photographed. Every death was documented. Every procedure was described in clinical detail. Rascher filed regular reports with the Luftwaffe Medical Service and with Heinrich Himmler's personal office. He presented findings at a medical conference attended by 95 German aviation medicine specialists. He created charts, graphs, and data tables showing the relationship between water temperature, immersion time, and human survival rates. In other words, Rascher built the prosecution's case for them, page by page, experiment by experiment, death by death. Second, the experiments had a thin veneer of military justification that the defense would certainly exploit. Luftwaffe pilots shot down over the North Sea were dying of hypothermia before rescue. German sailors whose ships sank in Arctic waters were freezing to death in minutes. The military wanted answers. How long can a human survive in freezing water? How do you revive someone on the edge of death from cold? Legitimate questions, questions that might save lives. But here's the problem. Answering those questions ethically requires volunteers who give informed consent, who understand the risks, who can stop the experiment if they're in danger. The Dachau experiments had none of that. What they had instead were prisoners, men who couldn't refuse, men who had no idea what was about to happen, men who were told they were being transferred to work detail and instead found themselves strapped into tanks of ice water while doctors stood by with stopwatches taking notes. Let me walk you through exactly how these experiments worked, because the methodology reveals everything about what the judges would later call murder disguised as science. Prisoners were selected from the camp population, mostly Russians and Poles, political prisoners, men already weakened by months of malnutrition and forced labor. They were brought to a specially designated medical facility where Rascher had set up his equipment. Large tanks capable of holding a human body, temperature control systems, medical monitoring devices, everything you'd expect in a legitimate research laboratory. Except the subjects weren't patients, they were specimens. The procedure was systematic. Prisoners were stripped naked. Medical staff recorded baseline vital signs, body temperature, heart rate, blood pressure. Then the subject was immersed in a tank filled with ice water. The water temperature was precisely controlled, typically between 2 and 12 degrees Celsius, just above freezing. And then the doctors waited and watched and took notes. They monitored how long it took for body temperature to drop. They recorded the onset of unconsciousness. They measured the point at which the heart began to fail. They documented everything: muscle spasms, respiratory distress, the exact moment brain function began to deteriorate. Some prisoners died in the tanks. Others were pulled out just before death and subjected to rewarming experiments, testing different revival methods, hot baths, heated blankets, electric warming devices, even body-to-body warming, using female prisoners forced to lie naked with the hypothermic victims. The survival rate depended on how aggressive the revival attempt was. Many died during rewarming. Their hearts, weakened by extreme cold, couldn't handle the stress. Rascher documented all of it, and here's what makes this particularly chilling. Rascher didn't hide what he was doing. He photographed the experiments, he created detailed reports, he filed them with military medical authorities, he even presented preliminary findings at a conference in October 1942 in Nuremberg, ironically in the same city where he'd later be prosecuted. Why such meticulous documentation? Because Rascher believed this was legitimate research. He thought he was contributing to military medicine, saving German lives. The prisoners weren't people to him. They were data points, variables in an equation. January 1947. The prosecution begins presenting evidence, and the courtroom atmosphere changes immediately. Prosecutors don't start with emotional appeals or survivor testimony. They start with documents, report after report, describing the freezing experiments in clinical language. Rascher's correspondence with Himmler requesting prisoners. Equipment requisitions, showing precisely what was purchased and when. Conference presentations, showing which doctors knew about the experiments and said nothing. Then they bring in the photographs. Images of prisoners submerged in ice water tanks, bodies rigid with cold, faces contorted in agony. Medical staff standing beside the tanks with clipboards recording observations. These photographs were taken by Rascher's team, proud documentation of their research. The courtroom goes silent. Even defense attorneys, who have seen considerable evidence by this point, are visibly shaken. Because the photographs make the crime undeniable, they show doctors watching men die. Not in a moment of battlefield chaos, not during emergency care under impossible conditions, but in a controlled laboratory environment with time to stop, time to intervene, and choosing not to. One photograph becomes particularly significant during the trial. It shows a prisoner in a water tank, his face barely above the surface, eyes wide with terror. Two men in white coats stand beside the tank. One holds a clipboard, the other checks a thermometer. Their expressions are calm, clinical, detached. They could be observing a chemistry experiment. Prosecutors return to this photograph repeatedly because it captures everything they need the judges to understand. This isn't cruelty driven by rage or hatred. This is systematic observation of human death, conducted by trained physicians who have completely abandoned their obligation to heal. But documents and photographs alone don't capture the human dimension of what happened. So the prosecution calls survivors, men who were subjected to the freezing experiments and somehow lived. Their testimony is devastating. One survivor takes the stand in late January. His name is recorded in the trial transcripts, but what matters isn't his identity. What matters is his account. He describes being selected for what guards called special duty. He describes being brought to a medical facility separate from the main camp. He describes seeing tanks, medical equipment, men in white coats who looked like doctors. He describes being told to undress, being examined, having his temperature and pulse recorded. He describes the confusion when he realized what was about to happen, the terror when he was strapped down, the moment he was lowered into ice water so cold it felt like his skin was burning. He describes the pain, not the numbing cold you experience in winter. Pain, intense, searing agony as his body temperature dropped. He describes losing sensation in his limbs. He describes the moment his mind started to disconnect, when thoughts became fragmented, when he stopped feeling anything at all and believed he was dying. He describes waking up hours later disoriented and in agony, covered in blankets, unable to move. He describes watching other prisoners go through the same process over the following weeks. Some woke up like he did, many didn't. He describes seeing bodies carried out, blue and rigid. And then he says something that makes the entire courtroom lean forward. He describes Dr. Rasher's demeanor during the experiments. Not angry, not cruel in the way of a sadistic guard. Excited, clinical, fascinated. When a prisoner survived an extreme immersion time, Rasher and his team celebrated it as a scientific breakthrough. When a prisoner died, they discussed it as an interesting data point. They took notes throughout, treating human suffering like a physics demonstration. Defense attorneys try to cross-examine. They suggest the witness might be mistaken, that memory after years of trauma might be unreliable, that perhaps he's exaggerating. The witness responds simply. He watched men die in those tanks. He nearly died himself. You don't forget that. You don't exaggerate that. And the physical evidence supports everything he's saying. All those reports prosecutors have already entered into evidence match his testimony exactly. The procedures he describes are the procedures Rasher documented. The deaths he witnessed are the deaths Rasher recorded. Now the defense has to respond, and they face an impossible task. How do you defend doctors who photographed their own crimes? How do you explain away documentation that shows premeditation, systematic killing, and complete moral abandonment? They try several approaches. First, military necessity. Defense attorney Dr. Robert Servatius stands before the tribunal and makes his case. Germany was fighting a total war. Luftwaffe pilots were dying in the North Sea. Naval crews were freezing to death in Arctic waters. The research, while harsh, could save thousands of German lives. He argues that no nation's military medical research is entirely ethical during wartime. Difficult circumstances require difficult choices. It's a calculated argument. The defense is betting that the judges, who have seen the devastation of total war, will accept that extreme situations justify extreme measures. The prosecution's response is simple and devastating. Did any of these prisoners volunteer? Did any of them give informed consent? Did any of them have the right to refuse? The answer to all three questions is no. And that single fact undermines the entire military necessity defense. Because medical ethics, even in wartime, requires consent. Soldiers who volunteer for dangerous missions know the risks. Pilots who test experimental aircraft understand they might die. Prisoners forced into ice water tanks don't get that choice. Second, the defense tries to argue the experiments weren't as deadly as prosecutors claim. Defense attorneys point to Rasher's reports showing some subjects survived. They argue that survival rates improved as Rasher refined his rewarming techniques. They suggest this proves the research had genuine scientific value, that the goal was learning how to save lives, not taking them. The prosecution brings in expert witnesses to destroy this argument. American and British military doctors who specialize in hypothermia research review Rasher's methodology, and they tear it apart. One expert, a U.S. Navy physician with years of Arctic survival research experience, testifies that Rasher's experimental design was fundamentally flawed. The data was contaminated by variables Rasher never controlled for. Different subjects had different body mass, different health conditions, different levels of exhaustion from camp life. The water temperatures weren't consistently maintained between experiments. The rewarming protocols changed repeatedly. In other words, the research wasn't even good science. It was torture that produced unreliable data. Subjects died, and the information gained couldn't even be used effectively because the methodology was so poor. The expert goes further. He testifies that legitimate hypothermia research was being conducted by Allied militaries during the same period, using volunteers, using controlled conditions, using protocols that stopped the experiment immediately if the subject showed signs of danger, and that research produced better, more reliable data without killing anyone. So the defense's justification collapses. The experiments weren't necessary. They weren't scientifically valid. They were simply murder with clinical documentation. Third, the defense tries the following orders argument. Several defendants claim they were ordered to participate, that refusing would have meant court-martial or execution, that they had no choice under military law. This argument works for some defendants. Lower-level medical staff who assisted but didn't design the experiments received lighter sentences. The tribunal acknowledges that junior personnel operating under direct orders in a military dictatorship have limited agency. But for the senior doctors, the men who designed, approved, and advocated for the experiments, this defense fails completely, because the evidence shows they weren't reluctant participants following orders under threat. They were enthusiastic volunteers pursuing career advancement. Rascher wrote letters to Himmler proposing experiments. Other doctors requested access to camp prisoners for their own research projects. Conference presentations show doctors discussing results with professional interest, debating methodology, suggesting improvements. These men weren't soldiers following battlefield commands. They were researchers who saw prisoners as an opportunity. The experiments boosted their reputations, generated publications, secured funding, led to promotions within military medical hierarchies. This wasn't obedience under duress. This was ambition. And here's what makes this particularly damning. In October 1942, Rascher presented his preliminary freezing experiment findings at a conference in Nuremberg attended by 95 German aviation medicine specialists. He explicitly stated the experiments were conducted at Dachau using camp prisoners. He described conditions no volunteer would ever accept. Hours in near-freezing water pushed to the point of unconsciousness. Multiple deaths. No one objected. No one reported it to any ethics authority. Several doctors asked technical questions about his findings. Some requested copies of his data. A few suggested modifications to his experimental protocols. The tribunal hears all of this. Weeks of testimony. Hundreds of documents. Dozens of witnesses. And slowly the legal framework takes shape. The judges aren't just deciding whether these specific men are guilty. They're establishing a principle that will govern medicine for generations. By March 1947, both sides have made their cases, and the tribunal adjourns to deliberate. The judges face an unprecedented decision. They're not just determining guilt. They're deciding what medicine is allowed to do, what no military emergency can justify, what crossing the line means for a profession built on trust. And they're deciding whether execution is necessary or whether imprisonment is sufficient. This is the moment where the fear takes hold, the fear that shapes their final decision. Let me explain what I mean. The judges review the evidence one more time. They look at Rascher's reports. They examine the photographs. They read survivor testimony. They consider the defense arguments about military necessity and wartime pressure. And they realize something that changes everything. These doctors didn't think they were committing crimes. They thought they were advancing science. They documented their work openly because they expected recognition, not prosecution. They presented findings at conferences because they believed the medical community would celebrate their research. That realization terrifies the judges, because if educated, licensed physicians can convince themselves that torturing prisoners to death is acceptable medical research, if they can present those findings at conferences and receive professional recognition instead of moral condemnation, then the medical profession itself has been corrupted at its foundation. And here's the fear that drives everything that follows. If these doctors receive prison sentences, if they're allowed to live, what message does that send to the next generation of physicians who might face similar choices? What does it tell future regimes that might want to use medical research as cover for atrocities? It tells them that medical crimes are survivable, that you can torture and kill in the name of science, and if your side loses, you'll spend a decade or two in prison and eventually be released. That the worst consequence of turning medicine into murder is losing your medical license and serving time. The judges realize that without the ultimate penalty, they risk normalizing the unthinkable. They risk creating a precedent that says doctors who commit atrocities are somehow different from soldiers who commit atrocities, that white coats provide a layer of protection that uniforms don't. But there's still debate among the judges. Some argue that life imprisonment achieves the same goal, that keeping these men locked away until they die of natural causes prevents them from practicing medicine again and serves as adequate deterrent. And then comes the testimony that changes everything. The moment that makes execution not just justified, but necessary in the judges' minds. It happens during the testimony of Dr. Franz Blaha, a Czech physician who was imprisoned at Dachau from 1941 to 1945. Unlike other survivors who were victims of experiments, Blaha was forced to work in the camp's medical facilities. He's a physician describing what other physicians did. His testimony carries the weight of professional expertise. The prosecutor asks Blaha to describe what he witnessed during the freezing experiments. Blaha's response is calm, measured, clinical. He describes watching Rasher select prisoners. He describes how prisoners were told they were going to light work assignments and instead found themselves in a medical facility facing equipment they didn't understand. He describes their confusion turning to terror, their screams that lasted for hours, their bodies carried out afterward, blue and rigid. He describes performing autopsies on some of those bodies and finding massive internal damage, frozen tissue, pulmonary hemorrhaging, hearts that failed under stress. But then Blaha says something that makes the entire courtroom go silent. He testifies that Rasher and his medical team were excited during the experiments, that they discussed findings with enthusiasm, that when a prisoner survived an extreme immersion time, they celebrated it as a breakthrough, that when a prisoner died, they analyzed it as an interesting data point worthy of publication. He describes one specific incident, a prisoner who survived 90 minutes in ice water at near freezing temperature. By all medical understanding, the man should have been dead, but somehow his heart kept beating. When he was pulled out, Rasher was ecstatic. He called other doctors over to observe. He talked about presenting this case at the next conference. He discussed the implications for military survival training. The prisoner died 3 hours later during rewarming. Blaha describes Rasher's reaction. Disappointment, but clinical disappointment. Not grief, not horror at having killed a man. Disappointment that the subject didn't survive long enough to provide more complete data on extreme duration cold exposure recovery. Blaha describes another moment, a prisoner begging to be removed from the tank, screaming that he couldn't feel his legs, that he was dying. Rasher checking his watch, consulting his protocol sheet, and saying, 5 more minutes. Not with cruelty. With the same tone a researcher might use when timing a chemical reaction, the prisoner lost consciousness before the 5 minutes elapsed. He never woke up. Rasher recorded the time of unconsciousness, had the body removed, and prepared for the next experiment. This testimony does something that all the documents and photographs couldn't fully accomplish. It shows the judges that these doctors didn't just commit atrocities under pressure or in moments of weakness. They transformed atrocity into routine. They made systematic murder feel like normal work. They took the sacred obligation of medicine to heal, to protect, to do no harm, and inverted it so completely that watching men die became just another day at the laboratory. And here's what terrifies the judges. If doctors can normalize murder this thoroughly, if they can watch people die and feel nothing but professional interest, then the corruption runs deeper than individual crimes. It means the entire framework of medical ethics collapsed. It means that under the right conditions, with the right incentives, physicians can convince themselves that anything is acceptable if it's done in the name of research. The judges reconvene privately after Blaha's testimony. According to later accounts from tribunal staff, the deliberation shifts at this point. The question is no longer whether the defendants are guilty. It's whether imprisonment is sufficient to prevent this from ever happening again. One judge poses the question that frames everything. If these men receive life sentences, what stops the next regime from recruiting doctors by promising them that medical crimes carry limited consequences? What stops ambitious researchers in future wars from seeing prisoners as opportunities? Another judge responds, "We're not just sentencing these men, we're defining what medicine is. And if medicine can include what happened at Dachau and result in anything less than the ultimate penalty, we're telling the world that doctors operate under different rules, that the white coat provides protection." The judges reach their conclusion. Execution isn't about revenge. It isn't even primarily about punishment. It's about drawing a line so absolute, so unmistakable, that no future doctor can claim ignorance. It's about making clear that turning medicine into murder places you beyond redemption, that no scientific justification, no military necessity, no career ambition can excuse what these men did. The one thing the judges feared would happen without executions. They would create a world where medical atrocities became calculated career risks instead of unthinkable crimes, where doctors in future conflicts would weigh potential scientific advancement against potential prison time and decide the risk was acceptable, where the next Rasher would look at Dachau and think, those doctors did groundbreaking research and got prison sentences. I can survive 10 years in prison for that kind of career advancement. August the 20th, 1947. The tribunal reconvenes. The courtroom is packed with international press, military observers, legal experts, and survivors hoping for justice. Judge Walter Beals presiding begins reading the judgment. The first section addresses jurisdiction and legal framework. The tribunal establishes that crimes against humanity can be prosecuted, even when committed by nationals against their own citizens during wartime. This is unprecedented. It means that just following national law, or just following orders, isn't a defense when the acts violate fundamental human dignity. Then the judgment shifts to specific experiments and specific defendants. When it reaches the section on the freezing experiments, the language becomes sharp and unambiguous. The judges don't just find the defendants guilty, they explain in detail why these experiments represent something beyond ordinary war crimes. The judgment states that the freezing experiments lacked any scientific justification that could excuse the suffering inflicted, that the experiments were conducted without consent and with full knowledge that subjects would die or suffer permanent injury, that prisoners were selected specifically because they were powerless and expendable, that the deaths were not accidental consequences of research, but expected outcomes that researchers documented with clinical detachment. The tribunal emphasizes a crucial distinction. The researchers weren't trying to minimize harm while gathering necessary data. They were pushing subjects to extremes specifically to see what would happen. They were testing limits, not developing therapies. And that distinction transforms the experiments from harsh wartime research into systematic murder. The judgment addresses each defense argument and dismantles them methodically. Military necessity? Irrelevant when the research methodology guarantees deaths that could be avoided. Following orders? Not applicable when the researchers volunteered and showed enthusiasm. Scientific value? Negated by fundamentally flawed methodology that produced unreliable data. And then the judgment makes a broader point, one that transcends this specific trial. The tribunal states that certain principles of medical ethics are so fundamental they apply regardless of national law, military orders, or wartime conditions. That consent is absolute, that human subjects must never be reduced to experimental material, that physicians bear a special obligation that no military rank or state authority can override. This is the birth of what will become known as the Nuremberg Code. 10 principles governing medical research involving human subjects. Principles that begin with one absolute requirement. The voluntary consent of the human subject is essential, not preferred, not ideal when circumstances allow, essential, always, no exceptions. The judgment explains that the evidence from Dachau, specifically the freezing experiments, made this principle unavoidable, because Rascher's reports showed exactly what happens when consent is eliminated, when prisoners become specimens, when death becomes data, when the entire apparatus of scientific research, peer review, conferences, publications, is corrupted by the absence of that single fundamental safeguard. Now comes the sentencing, the moment when legal judgment becomes moral reckoning. The tribunal announces that 7 defendants will be sentenced to death by hanging. Karl Brandt, Hitler's personal physician and the most senior medical official in the dock, Rudolf Brandt, Himmler's administrative aide who coordinated prisoner transfers for experiments, Joachim Rogowski, chief of hygiene for the SS who oversaw multiple camp experiments, Wolfram Sievers, Reich business manager of the Ahnenerbe, the SS research organization that funded atrocity research, Victor Brack, organizer of the T4 euthanasia program that killed disabled Germans, Waldemar Hoven, chief doctor at Buchenwald concentration camp, Karl Gebhardt, senior SS physician who conducted surgical experiments. Of these 7, multiple defendants had direct connections to the Dachau freezing experiments. Brandt approved them. Sievers facilitated funding. Their signatures appear on approval documents, equipment requisitions, prisoner transfer orders. 5 defendants receive life imprisonment. 4 receive prison terms ranging from 10 to 20 years. 7 are acquitted, though several face immediate rearrest for other crimes. The death sentences shock portions of the international medical community, not because anyone doubts the crimes occurred, but because execution seems so final, so irreversible. Some observers argue that life imprisonment would be more appropriate, that these men should be studied, their psychology analyzed, their descent from healers to killers examined for warning signs that might prevent future atrocities. But the tribunal's reasoning is clear and deliberate. These men didn't just violate medical ethics, they systematically corrupted an entire profession. They turned hospitals into laboratories of death. They made doctor a word prisoners feared. And most damningly, they documented their crimes with pride, intending to publish, to advance their careers, to gain recognition for research built on corpses. The judgment specifically cites the freezing experiments when explaining why execution is necessary. The tribunal notes that these experiments demonstrate planning, persistence, and complete moral bankruptcy. That Rascher conducted experiments for nearly a year, watching dozens of men die and never once reconsidered. That senior doctors reviewed his work and saw opportunity for advancement, not crimes against humanity. The judges conclude that some crimes are so fundamental, so destructive of basic human values, that the only proportionate response is execution. That allowing these men to live would suggest their crimes were somehow less than murder. That the tribunal must send an unmistakable message. Medicine has limits, and crossing them carries the ultimate penalty. Here's what the judges understood that many observers didn't. This wasn't about these 7 men. This was about the next 100 doctors who might face similar choices in future conflicts. The judges were terrified that without executions, they would establish a precedent that medical atrocities carried survivable consequences. that ambitious researchers in future wars would calculate risk versus reward and decide that a decade in prison was worth groundbreaking research and career advancement. The judges feared creating a world where doctors looked at the Dachau experiments and thought, those men did important research and got prison sentences. I can handle prison if it means making history. So they drew a line, not with anger, not with vengeance, with cold calculation. They decided that protecting future victims required making an example so absolute that no doctor could claim ignorance of the consequences. June the 2nd, 1948, Landsberg Prison, Bavaria. The 7 condemned men are executed by hanging. The process is swift and efficient, carried out according to military protocol. No drama, no last-minute reprieves, just the mechanical implementation of justice. Karl Brandt's last words are reportedly a defense of his actions. He claims he was trying to help the German people, that history would vindicate him. History has done the opposite. His name is now synonymous with medical evil, taught in ethics classes as an example of how far medicine can fall when it abandons its core principles. The executions mark a turning point, not just in law, but in the fundamental understanding of what medicine is. The trial established principles that now govern all human subject research worldwide. Every medical study, every clinical trial, every experiment involving humans traces its ethical framework back to those judgments issued in Nuremberg. The Nuremberg Code becomes the foundation for all subsequent medical ethics frameworks. The Declaration of Helsinki in 1964, the Belmont Report in 1979, modern institutional review boards, informed consent forms. All of it stems from the recognition, forced by the evidence from Dachau, that medicine without consent is not medicine at all. Let me show you why this matters today. Why experiments conducted in 1942 and prosecuted in 1947 still shape every interaction you have with medical science. When you participate in a clinical trial, you sign a consent form. That form exists because of Dachau. When researchers explain risks and benefits before you agree to participate, that requirement exists because of what judges saw in those freezing experiment reports. When institutional review boards evaluate research protocols before they're approved, that entire oversight system exists because the Nuremberg Tribunal decided that medical research needs external ethics review. The principle is simple. Your body belongs to you. No doctor, no matter how qualified, no matter how important the research, no matter how many lives might theoretically be saved, can use your body for experiments without your informed, voluntary consent. That principle seems obvious now. In 1947, it wasn't codified anywhere in international law. It became law because prosecutors laid out Rascher's reports on a table in Nuremberg and forced the world to confront what medicine looks like when that principle disappears. But here's something most people don't know. The legacy of the Dachau experiments is complicated and morally fraught in ways that extend beyond the trial. After the war, questions emerged about what to do with the data. Rascher's freezing experiments, flawed as they were, generated information about hypothermia that didn't exist elsewhere. Some military researchers quietly wondered whether the data should be used. Whether ignoring it meant those deaths were completely meaningless. Whether using it dishonored the victims, or at least extracted some value from their suffering. This debate happened behind closed doors in medical and military circles. Most physicians argued that using data from unethical experiments legitimizes the methodology and encourages future atrocities. That the data should be buried, never cited, never referenced, treated as if it doesn't exist. A minority argued that the murders already happened, that the victims are already dead, that refusing to use information that might save future lives is itself unethical. The debate was never fully resolved. Officially, major medical journals and research institutions agreed never to cite Nazi experiment data. But rumors persist that some military cold water survival protocols incorporated insights from Dachau research without explicit citation. The truth is murky, probably unknowable. What's clear is this: the judges who sentenced those 7 doctors to death understood they were doing more than punishing individual criminals. They were establishing a moral framework that would govern medicine for generations. They were saying that some knowledge isn't worth obtaining, that some research questions shouldn't be answered, that human dignity places absolute limits on what science can do. And here's why the judge's fear was justified. Here's why execution was the right call, not as punishment, but as prevention. In the decades since Nuremberg, there have been numerous cases where medical researchers pushed ethical boundaries, where the lessons of Dachau had to be relearned, where doctors forgot or ignored the principle that consent is absolute. The Tuskegee syphilis study in the United States. From 1932 to 1972, researchers studied untreated syphilis in black men without informing them they had the disease, and without treating them even after penicillin became available. The men thought they were receiving free health care. They were actually being observed as their disease progressed, causing blindness, dementia, and death. When the study was exposed in 1972, investigators cited the Nuremberg Code. They pointed to the principles established in 1947 and said, "This is exactly what Nuremberg prohibited. experiments without consent, subjects who don't understand what's being done to them, research that harms people for the sake of data. The Tuskegee study was shut down. Reforms were implemented. The Belmont Report was created, establishing modern ethical guidelines for human subject research in the United States, all because the Nuremberg principles provided a framework for saying, this is unacceptable. Or consider the Willowbrook hepatitis studies in the 1950s and 1960s. Researchers at a New York institution for children with intellectual disabilities deliberately infected children with hepatitis to study the disease progression and test potential vaccines. Parents were told their children would receive good care. They weren't told their children would be intentionally infected with a dangerous disease. When the studies were exposed, ethicists pointed to Nuremberg. They said consent wasn't truly informed if parents didn't understand the risks. That vulnerable populations like children and institutionalized people need extra protection, not exploitation. That the researchers had crossed the line the Nuremberg tribunal drew. These cases show that the judges were right to fear what would happen without absolute consequences. Because even with executions, even with the Nuremberg Code, even with clear legal precedent, doctors still crossed ethical lines, still saw vulnerable populations as research opportunities, still convinced themselves that scientific advancement justified harmful experiments. Imagine what would have happened if the Dachau doctors had received prison sentences and been quietly released after a decade. Imagine if the message from Nuremberg had been, medical experiments without consent are crimes, but survivable crimes. You'll lose your career and do some prison time, but you'll live. That message would have encouraged every ambitious researcher who saw ethical review as an obstacle, every doctor who believed their research was important enough to bypass consent, every scientist who viewed prisoners or institutionalized people or minority populations as convenient test subjects. But here's what the executions accomplished. They made it clear that turning medicine into murder places you beyond redemption, that no scientific justification saves you, that the white coat doesn't protect you, that if you reduce human beings to experimental material, society will respond with ultimate severity. And that message, delivered through the gallows, created a foundation that has protected billions of people over the past 75 years. Every time a researcher considers cutting ethical corners, the shadow of Nuremberg hangs over that decision. Every institutional review board that rejects a risky protocol is enforcing principles established when those 7 doctors were sentenced to death. The judges understood something profound. They understood that professions built on trust require absolute boundaries, that medicine depends on patients believing doctors won't harm them, that the moment people fear their doctor might see them as research material rather than human beings, the entire medical system collapses. So they drew a line with 7 executions. They said to the medical community, "This is your profession's sacred boundary. Cross it, and you're not a doctor who committed a crime. You're a murderer who happened to have a medical degree, and murderers who systematically kill dozens of people while documenting their crimes face the gallows." Let me bring this back to the specific fear that drove the judge's decision. The one thing they feared would happen without executions. They feared that failing to execute doctors for turning medicine into murder would normalize the idea that atrocities conducted under the cover of research are somehow different from other atrocities, that they're crimes of a lesser category, that educated professionals who document their murders deserve different treatment than soldiers who commit murders on battlefields. That normalization would have been catastrophic. It would have told future doctors that medical crimes carry reduced consequences, that if you're smart enough to frame murder as research, if you're careful enough to document everything in clinical language, if you're connected enough to get institutional approval, you can survive getting caught. The judges realized that this thinking would guarantee future atrocities. That the next war, the next authoritarian regime, the next ambitious researcher would look at Dachau and calculate, those doctors got prison sentences. I can handle 10 years in prison for career-making research. I can write papers in prison. I can be released while I'm still young enough to practice. And I'll be the doctor who answered questions no one else dared to ask. So the judges made execution mandatory for the worst offenders. They made the consequence so severe that no calculation of risk versus reward could justify crossing that line. They made the penalty so final that career ambition couldn't overcome moral horror. And it worked, not perfectly. Tuskegee and Willowbrook show that some researchers still crossed ethical lines. But those abuses were exposed and stopped because the Nuremberg framework existed, because investigators could point to clear principles and say, this is prohibited, this is what we hang doctors for doing. Without those executions, without that absolute line, medical research ethics would have remained murky. Researchers could have argued that wartime necessity or scientific importance justified harsh methods, that consent was a peacetime luxury, that vulnerable populations should accept their role as research subjects for the greater good. The executions ended that argument before it could take root. They established that consent isn't negotiable, that human dignity isn't suspended during wartime, that no research question justifies treating people as expendable material. So here's what the Nuremberg judges accomplished with those 7 death sentences. They protected every person who has participated in medical research over the past 75 years. They created the legal and ethical framework that requires doctors to see you as a human being with rights, not as a potential data source. When you sign a consent form, when a researcher explains risks and benefits, when an institutional review board examines a protocol and asks, is this ethical? All of that exists because 7 doctors were hanged for freezing prisoners to death at Dachau. The judges looked at Rascher's reports, at the photographs of prisoners in ice water tanks, at the testimony from survivors describing doctors who watched men die with clinical detachment, and they realized they weren't just prosecuting past crimes, they were preventing future ones. They understood that medicine is uniquely dangerous when it abandons ethics, that doctors have knowledge and access that can be weaponized, that patients have to trust their doctors with their bodies, their lives, their most vulnerable moments. And if that trust is broken, if doctors become threats rather than healers, the consequences ripple through society in ways that ordinary crimes don't. So they made an example, not out of vengeance, but out of calculated prevention. They said to every future doctor, this is the price of crossing the line. Not prison, not career loss, death, because some professions carry obligations so sacred that violating them places you beyond redemption. Let me leave you with 2 questions. Drop your answers in the comments because I genuinely want to know what you think. First, do you believe the death penalty was necessary for the Dachau doctors, or would life imprisonment have sent the same message? Would those men rotting in prison for decades have been sufficient to prevent future medical atrocities? Or was execution the only way to draw an absolute line? Second, where do you think the boundary is between legitimate medical research and unethical experimentation? We have clear cases like Dachau on one end and routine clinical trials on the other. But what about the gray areas? Research on prisoners who technically volunteer but have limited choices, studies on children who can't give informed consent, experiments during public health emergencies when time pressure is real? Where's the line? I read every comment, and I'm fascinated by how people think about these questions. Because the judges at Nuremberg didn't have the luxury of hindsight. They had to make decisions that would shape medicine for generations based on evidence they were seeing for the first time. They chose execution. They chose to make medical atrocities capital crimes. And whether you agree with that choice or not, you have to acknowledge its impact. The protections you have today when you walk into a hospital, when you participate in research, when you trust a doctor with your care, those protections exist because of what happened in courtroom 600 in Nuremberg when 7 men learned they would hang for turning medicine into murder. If you found this analysis valuable, hit that subscribe button. I do deep dives into World War II history, war crimes trials, and the legal and moral decisions that shaped the post-war world. And if you made it this far, drop a like on the video. It helps tremendously with the algorithm and lets me know you want more content like this. The one thing the judges feared would happen without Nazi executions was this. They feared creating a world where doctors could calculate that medical atrocities were survivable career risks, where ambitious researchers would see prisoners and vulnerable populations as opportunities, where the phrase, "I was doing research," could excuse systematic murder. So they drew a line with the gallows, and that line has protected billions of people over the past 75 years. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.